You might think a pine cone is nothing more than yard trash, something you sweep up every windy season and forget, but on a medieval winter night, when the cold was sharp enough to freeze your breath mid-air and the wind scraped against the walls like metal claws, that trash once saved an entire family. In darkness thick as tree resin, when the fire in the hearth was collapsing into dull red embers and the children had just begun to shiver as the cold slipped through every seam in the timber walls, the mother didn't run to find firewood, didn't panic trying to spark a new flame. She simply reached down, picked up a few dry pine cones stored from the previous season, and tossed them onto the fading coals. A sharp crackle burst to life instantly. The hot resin scent filled the room, and a stubborn little flame rose again, just enough to pull the entire household back from the edge of a freezing night. To us, pine cones are debris. To them, they were a survival switch, a natural ignition tool that stood between life and ice. And the real shock isn't medieval creativity, it's how completely we've forgotten the things they considered obvious. So think about it. If you were stranded in the forest right now, with no dry wood, no charcoal, no gear, would you even recognize that you're standing right next to one of nature's oldest survival tools? If this changed the way you see everyday things, drop a comment and share what other natural, secret weapons you think our ancestors once relied on. You've probably heard people say medieval families used pine cones as a night log. Just toss one onto the coals and the fire will still be alive by morning. It sounds reasonable, even a little poetic, but the truth is far harsher. Pine cones burn fast, light, and nowhere near long enough to keep embers alive through a freezing night. So why does this story exist at all? Because it hides a far more powerful secret, one that every survivor understood. The true value of a pine cone wasn't endurance, but ignition. Picture a wet night in the forest, wind whipping through the canopy, every dry-looking branch soaked to the core, your fingers numb, your breath turning to mist, and you trembling under the dripping dark. You try to kindle a fire with twigs, but they only sputter smoke and die. In that moment of desperation, what you need isn't an overnight log, you need a spark amplifier, a sudden burst of heat strong enough to wake an entire fire back from the dead. And that's exactly what a dry pine cone is. The instant a spark touches its resin, it becomes a tiny furnace burning hot, concentrated, and stubborn enough to dry wet sticks, ignite rotten leaves, and pull a dying campfire back up from cold mud. That is the real power of the pine cone. Not keeping a fire alive for 8 hours, but bringing it roaring back to life in 5 minutes. When night drops over the deep forest, there's one moment every camper dreads, that thick, rising buzz forming right behind your neck. You swat at the air, you pull your collar higher, but the swarm doesn't leave there waiting for warmth, waiting for skin, waiting for that split second when you lose focus. Picture it, the fire flickering weakly, cold winds sliding through the canopy, and the air itself turning heavy with tiny black specks circling right above your head. You know exactly what comes next, a sleepless night, or worse, a fever in the middle of the woods. And it's in that tense, a hopeless moment that something you treated as yard trash turns into the most unexpected weapon. You drop a dry pine cone onto the edge of the glowing embers. For a few seconds, nothing happens. Then suddenly the resin catches, releasing a thick white plume that twists, expands, and rolls out, as if someone were pulling a curtain of smoke straight from inside the tree. You're not ready for what happens next. The swarm of mosquitoes that was buzzing like a storm just a minute earlier disappears completely, wiped clean from the air. No chemicals, no stinging torches, just one pine cone, and the effect is almost instant. Here's the twist. Medieval people didn't know what terpenes were, didn't need science. They learned by living in the forest, watching with the eyes of survivors. They knew exactly which smoke made insects flee. We're the ones who forgot, and now we have to relearn it from scratch. If you've ever had a nightmare camping trip because of mosquitoes, drop a comment and tell us how many years earlier you wish you'd known about this natural protective smoke. You might have heard somewhere that medieval people burned pine cones indoors to clean the air, like some kind of natural disinfectant before science existed. It sounds reasonable, sounds ancient, sounds believable. But once you dig into the records, the truth surprises most people. There's almost no evidence that a medieval farmer ever stood in the middle of a tiny, dirt floor house intentionally purifying the air with pine cones. They burned whatever would catch fire to stay warm. Any side effect was accidental. But here's the twist. Even though their motive wasn't medical, the real effect of pine resin smoke was far stronger than modern people. Imagine, when resin hits heat, terpene compounds like alpha-pinene vaporize instantly, creating a white smoke that's fragrant, sharp, and surprisingly effective at suppressing airborne bacteria and mold. Not sterilizing in the modern sense, but enough to change the smell, cut dampness, and make a room feel less stale during cold, humid months. That's why pine smoke shows up in rituals, in house smudging traditions, in those moments when people wanted to refresh their living space, not because they understood microbes, but because they sensed the effect with the instincts of people who lived inside nature, not outside it. Today we rely on chemical sprays, air purifiers, synthetic scents, but sometimes all it takes is a little pine resin on hot coals and the whole room shifts instantly. Of all the myths about pine cones, the most dangerous might be the claim that medieval people used them, and pine wood in general, to smoke preserved meat and fish. It sounds plausible. Pine smoke is strong, resinous, antimicrobial sounding. But this is exactly the kind of belief that, if you tried it in real life, could wipe out your entire winter food supply in days. The real shock is this. Pine smoke is terrible for preservation. It's loaded with resin, producing a thick, bitter, sometimes toxic coating on food. Meat smoked with pine isn't just awful, it can make you sick. Medieval people were too experienced to ever make that mistake. But the real secret hides in something almost no one notices: the forest floor itself. Pine forest soil, thick with dry needles, quick draining, and lightly acidic, creates a natural environment that resists mold, moisture, and bacterial growth. Medieval families may not have preserved with pine smoke, but they absolutely preserved beneath the pines. A shallow pit lined with pine needles and a layer of dry cones at the bottom creates a natural airflow pocket, essentially a miniature root cellar. Turnips, carrots, beets, and other hardy vegetables could sit there for weeks, even months, without spoiling. The surprise isn't that they smoked meat with pine, they didn't. The surprise is that they used the entire forest as a natural refrigerator. On medieval winter nights, when the wind hissed through every gap in the timber like someone whispering just beyond the darkness, light wasn't a convenience, it was the border between safety and fear. Medieval families didn't always have tallow candles or oil lamps to push back that darkness. But scattered through old folk tales is a quieter, stranger kind of light, the pine cone lantern. Not a roaring torch, not a smoky flame filling the hut, but a single green cone heavy with resin set on a flat stone in the center of the shelter. When the tip was lit, it didn't flare up. It breathed. A small, steady ember worked its way inward, making the whole cone glow like a coal with a heartbeat. Outside, the wind clawed at the high-draped doorway. Inside, a mother threaded a needle and repaired her child's coat by that soft, ember-red light. No thick smoke, no wild flames, just a tiny circle of warmth and glow, persistent in a way that felt almost unreal. And that stillness created a kind of quiet magic, as if the light wasn't burning at all, but revealing a secret the pine forest had been holding for anyone patient enough to watch. Today we'd call it a pine cone candle. To them, it was the light of vigilance, the small flame that kept hands steady through the coldest hours. Secrets like this vanish the moment we stop paying attention to nature. If you've ever stumbled on a technique that sounded like folklore but worked with impossible precision, share it. It might be another surviving fragment of ancient knowledge we've forgotten to notice. Many retellings of the Middle Ages like to imagine pine cones being used to create towering signal columns, great white plumes rising from hilltops, carrying messages across miles of land. It sounds mystical, cinematic, almost too perfect. But when you check the real physics, the truth hits hard. A handful of pine cones can't create any visible column of smoke from a distance. They were never medieval beacons, never some dramatic warning flare glowing over castle walls. But the moment that myth collapses, the real secret appears, and it's far more unsettling. Medieval people didn't use pine cones to send signals into the sky. They used them to hear what moved in the dark. When fully dried, each woody scale on a pine cone becomes stiff and brittle, snapping sharply when disturbed. Hang a few cones on a cord around your camp, or stack them lightly along a boundary, and you've built a primitive alarm system, one that almost never fails. In the silent hours of the night, when the forest breathing swallows all other sound, even the slightest contact, a deer brushing past, a misplaced footstep, a hand creeping where it shouldn't, makes the cones twitch and crack with a dry, unmistakable snap, sharp enough to yank you awake before anything gets close. No fire, no light, just a sound that stands guard between you and whatever waits beyond sight. Of all the pine cone legends, the medicine myth is the one modern people get wrong most easily. You'll hear claims that medieval peasants scraped resin directly from pine cones and smeared it on wounds as a natural disinfectant. It sounds reasonable, even soothingly herbal, but the truth is nothing like that. Almost no one ever dug resin out of a cone. There's too little, it's too dry, and it's basically useless. Here's the twist. The real medicine wasn't in the cone at all. It was in the tree. When a pine trunk is wounded, it releases thick, golden, aromatic resin loaded with compounds we now know have powerful antibacterial, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory effects strong, enough to impress modern researchers. Medieval people didn't know the words alpha-pinene, terpene profile, or antimicrobial spectrum, but they absolutely knew that pine resin could stop bleeding, ease pain, seal a wound, and keep it from rotting. By gently heating the resin with a little animal, fat or oil, then adding beeswax, they created a sticky, long-lasting salve that could survive for months, a kind of forest medicine chest used across European mountain regions well into recent centuries. The shock isn't that they made medicine from pine cones. The shock is that they understood the forest better than most of us understand our own first aid kits. In the medieval forest at night, there was something far more terrifying than predators: absolute silence. When the wind stopped, when the leaves froze in place, when even your own breathing felt swallowed by the dark, every hunter knew exactly what that meant. Something was very close. No flashlights, no guns, no electronics. All they had were instincts and a few things nature scattered along their path. And among those tools, the strangest and most brilliant was the dry pine cone. Medieval hunters didn't use pine cones to send signals into the sky. They used them to stay alive. By stretching a thin cord around their camp and hanging a few open cones from it, or stacking small cone piles along the boundary, they built the medieval equivalent of a $100 security system. Those dried, brittle scales were stiff as bone, and any movement made them snap together with a sharp crack, a sound that sliced through the stillness clearer than any shout. Picture it: a hunter sleeping under a fur blanket, the fire long dead, darkness so thick he can't see his own fingers. Then, suddenly crack. Just that tiny sound is enough to make his heart jolt and his hand close around his knife, because he knows that noise never happens unless something has crossed the line between safety and danger. The irony? Medieval people had a zero-cost security system more reliable than what many modern homes use today. If you've ever spent a night where a single sound kept you wide awake, share your experience. Do you believe in this natural alarm system? If there's one moment that forces us to rethink everything about the pine cone, it's when you stand alone in the forest, pick up a dry one lying beneath the branches, and suddenly realize this thing you once treated as trash is actually a library of survival skills our modern world has almost completely forgotten. Small, rough, commercially worthless, yet once a source of light, fire, protection, air, purification, natural refrigeration, warning signals, and even medicine. The striking part isn't how clever medieval people were. It's how thoroughly the modern world has stripped us of instincts our ancestors saw as basic common sense. We turn on an air purifier when a room smells off. They tossed a bead of pine resin on a coal. We spend money on security systems. They hung a few cones around a shelter and listened for the sharp crack that meant danger. We treat nature like something to sterilize or fence off. They saw it as an endless toolkit waiting to be used the right way. And that's why recovering these old skills matters, not to live like the past, but to remember that safety, warmth, and resilience once came from the simplest things, the things we step over every day without a second glance. So here's the question. Have you ever discovered something in nature that looked ordinary but turned out unexpectedly powerful? Share it in the comments. It might spark the next video. And if you want to keep exploring these forgotten survival skills, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the natural secrets still quietly waiting for us.